I never forgot the exact second my mother decided to erase me in public. The private dining room looked like a jewelry box, all warm light and crystal, the kind of place where everyone laughs a little louder because the tablecloth is white and the water glasses are heavy. My sister sat under the chandelier like she belonged there, shoulders back, lips curved, soaking up attention as if it were oxygen. Then my mother stood, tapped her glass, and smiled that proud smile she saved for one child. She lifted her champagne and said it clear as a bell. "She is the daughter I am proud of." Applause spilled across the room. I clapped too because my hands knew the routine. And right as the sound started to fade, a waiter stepped to my side and placed a black folder in front of me. Inside was a bill for $1,980. My sister smirked. Everyone waited. The whole room went silent like they were watching to see if I would swallow it again. I stared at the number until it stopped looking like ink and started feeling like a bruise. The paper was thick, elegant, the kind that makes money feel polite. And still, my throat tightened the way it always did around my family, like my body was bracing for impact before my mind caught up. The waiter hovered one step back, hands folded, eyes careful. He had that professional smile that said he had seen 1,000 versions of wealthy drama and did not want to be a part of mine. Behind him, a server slid dessert plates onto the table, tall slices of cake with a candle on my sister's, and the smell of sugar and butter hit me like a cruel joke. My mother sat back down slowly, satisfied, her cheeks pink from the toast, her gaze floating past me the way it always did. She did not look at the bill. She did not look at my face. She looked at my sister. My sister Sienna lifted her glass like a queen, acknowledging her subjects. Her dress was a pale gold that caught the light when she moved her hair glossy and curled her makeup perfect in a way that looked effortless, but never was. She flicked her eyes to me for half a second, and I saw it, that tiny, smug curve at the corner of her mouth. Not surprise, not discomfort. Certainty. My father sat beside my mother, shoulders slightly hunched, hands near his lap, as if he was trying to make himself smaller. He stared at his plate like it held instructions. When he finally glanced up, his eyes met mine for a moment, then dropped away so fast it made my stomach twist. That was the thing about him. He did not create the favoritism, but he helped it live by refusing to interrupt it. Around us, relatives and friends filled the room, faces glowing from wine and celebration. A couple of my mother's friends from her church sat across the table, smiling as if they were watching something charming. A cousin I barely knew leaned in to whisper to her husband, then looked away when she caught me noticing. Everyone had a role in this family drama, even the ones who pretended they were just guests. I ran my fingers along the edge of the folder. It was warm from the waiter's hand, and it felt too heavy for paper. My heart beat hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to laugh because this was so absurd it should have been funny, but my face stayed calm. I had practiced calm for years. My mother took a slow sip of champagne and said, light and casual, "Morgan will take care of it." She always does. It was said like a compliment, like I was the dependable one, the good daughter, the mature one. But it landed on me like a chain. My name became a contract signed in front of everyone without my consent. The waiter's eyes flicked to me again, polite, questioning. He did not know he had walked into the middle of something old. I wanted to tell him, "This is not your problem, I promise." But my mother had made it everyone's problem the moment she decided to stage this. My sister laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded sweet if you did not know her. She leaned toward my mother and said, "Mom, you did not have to make a big deal about it." My mother brushed her hand in the air, dismissive. "It is a big deal. Tonight is your night. We are celebrating you properly." Properly. That word used to make me flinch when I was a kid. Properly meant what my mother wanted. Properly meant appearances. Properly meant that whatever made her look generous, loving, proud mattered more than whatever was true. Someone at the end of the table started clapping again, a second wave, like they were trying to revive the mood. Another person followed, and then the room filled with noise, forced and bright. People leaned toward Sienna, telling her how stunning she looked, how lucky she was, how exciting her year was going to be. The attention wrapped around her like a warm blanket. I sat there with the folder open on my lap, the black cover resting against my thigh. My skin felt too tight. My lungs felt too small. My palms were dry and cold at the same time. This was not the first time my parents had expected me to clean up after my sister, but it was the first time they did it with a spotlight. I had flown into Savannah that morning straight from a shift at the hospital in Raleigh, still tired in a way sleep never fully fixed. I had changed in the airport bathroom, pulled my hair back, put on makeup under fluorescent lights, and told myself to smile. It is just dinner. It is just one night. You can get through it. I did not come because I wanted to celebrate. I came because in this family absence became ammunition. If I stayed home, my mother would have said I was bitter. If I showed up, she could use me. I should have known which option she preferred. The room around me buzzed with conversation. Silverware scraped chairs, shifted wine was poured. A cousin across the table, Lila, stared at the cake, then at me, then at the folder. Her eyebrows pinched together. She looked like she was trying to decide whether to speak up or pretend she did not see it. She chose pretending. My mother leaned toward me, voice lower, her smile still in place. Don't do anything weird. Not tonight. My throat tightened so sharply I almost coughed. I looked at her, really looked, and I noticed the little details I usually ignored. The way her eyes shone when she had an audience. The way her mouth turned down just slightly when she looked at me. The way she seemed energized by the tension she created, like it made her feel important. I shifted in my chair and the folder slid a little. The waiter stepped closer just enough to quietly ask if everything was all right. He did not say it out loud, but his posture asked the question. I nodded once, a small movement. He retreated, grateful. My sister took her fork and cut into her cake. She did not touch the check. She did not even glance at it again. She just ate, savoring each bite as if she were consuming the moment as much as the dessert. I wanted to say something. I wanted to stand up right then and tell everyone exactly what this was. But my voice stayed stuck behind my teeth. Because saying no in my family was never simple. It was never just a decision. It was a threat to the story my mother told about us. The story was always the same. Sienna was the one with the sparkle, the one worth investing in, the one my mother bragged about. I was the steady one, the one who would never embarrass them, the one who would handle things quietly, the one who would not make a scene, the one who would pay. And if I did not, I already knew how it would go. My mother would look shocked, wounded, as if I had slapped her. My father would sigh and say, "Morgan, please." My sister would play innocent, her eyes wide, her voice trembling, asking why I was ruining her birthday. Relatives would exchange looks, and someone would say, "She is under a lot of stress," or "Family is family," or "Why are you being so difficult?" That was the trick of manipulation. They made the injustice feel like my responsibility to accept it gracefully. My mother raised her eyebrows at me, a silent command. She glanced toward the folder, then back to Sienna, as if my compliance was as predictable as the next song on a playlist. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I forced myself to breathe slowly because that was what I had learned to do in hospital rooms when families screamed at each other in grief. Breathe, stay steady, don't let their panic become yours. Funny how I could hold calm for strangers, but my own mother could still make me feel like a little girl trying not to cry at the dinner table. I closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, like maybe the number would change if I looked away long enough. It didn't. $1,980. With suggested gratuity and service charge, it climbed even higher, printed in neat lines that looked almost pretty. My mother leaned back and said loud enough for the people closest to hear, "Morgan is so good about these things." She's the responsible one. A few people chuckled politely. Someone murmured, "Bless her." Someone else nodded like it was sweet. I stared at the candle flame on Sienna's cake. It flickered in the air-conditioned room, stubbornly alive. I thought about how many times I had been called responsible, as if it were a personality trait instead of a role I was forced into. Responsible was just another word for convenient. My sister dabbed her lips with her napkin and looked at me again. Her eyes were bright, confident, unafraid. She tilted her head slightly like she was testing me. I saw that smirk return faint and quick the way a bully smiles when a teacher turns away. I realized something then, something that made my stomach drop. This was planned. My mother did not just assume I would pay. She had arranged for it. She had chosen this restaurant, this private room, this guest list, this moment right after the toast, right after she announced her pride. She had built a stage, and she had cast me as the silent servant to her golden child. My fingers tightened on the folder until the edge pressed into my skin. I felt anger rise slow at first, then sharper, a heat that started in my chest and moved up my neck. I had felt anger before plenty of times, but I had always swallowed it, smoothed it down with excuses. It is not worth it. Keep the peace. Be the bigger person. Don't start family drama. But sitting there with that bill in my lap and my mother glowing from applause, something in me shifted. Not a dramatic snap, not a sudden explosion. More like a door quietly closing. I looked at my father again. He was staring into his water-glass jaw clenched, as if he was holding words back. I waited just for a breath to see if he would do something different. He did not. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. My mother turned slightly toward him and he gave her a tiny nod, barely noticeable. Like approval. Like agreement. Like the whole thing had been settled before we even sat down. My throat burned. I swallowed hard. The waiter returned hesitant and stood at a respectful distance. He looked between me and my mother, then back to me as if trying to figure out who to address. He spoke softly. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am." My mother smiled at him, all charm, and said, "She will handle it." The way she said it made my skin crawl. Like she was proud of her control. Like she was proud that she could still make me do it. I opened my purse. The movement was automatic, like muscle memory. I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the voice that whispered, "Just pay and go home. You can talk about it later." Later never came. Later was just another way to keep me quiet. My hand brushed my wallet, then stopped. In my mind, I saw myself handing over my card, forcing a smile, swallowing the humiliation. I saw my mother relaxing, satisfied. I saw Sienna laughing as we left, already forgetting who had funded her night. And then I saw the next time. Another request. Another bill. Another crisis. Another moment where I was expected to be grateful for the privilege of being used. My hand hovered over the wallet and my fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, not exactly. From the effort it took to hold still against years of training. My mother's foot nudged mine under the table, a small, sharp kick, just enough to remind me that she could still correct me like a child. I lifted my eyes to her. She smiled, and it was not warm. It was warning. "Don't," she mouthed, barely moving her lips. The room felt too bright. The chandelier light glinted off glass and silver, making everything sparkle, while inside me, something dark and heavy settled into place. I thought about how many times I had told myself I needed boundaries. I thought about how many times I had set them softly, privately, only to have them ignored, because no one had to respect what I would not enforce. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the faint hum of conversation at the far end of the room, where people were still focused on Sienna, still laughing, still pretending this was normal. But near me, the air had changed. The people closest to us had gone quiet again. They were watching. They sensed it. They knew this was a moment. My mother reached for her champagne glass and took another sip, slow, confident. She believed she had already won. I looked down at the check one more time. It was not just a bill. It was a receipt for my place in this family. It was proof that my mother could crown one daughter with praise and chain the other to the cost, all in the same breath. The waiter shifted his weight, waiting for my card. My sister leaned back, satisfied candle still burning in front of her. And I felt my lips part, as if my body had decided before my mind was ready. My voice was going to come out whether I wanted it to or not, and I knew that whatever I said next would change the rest of the night, maybe the rest of our lives. I took my hand out of my purse and laid it flat on the table, palm down, steadying myself. I lifted my gaze to my mother, then to my sister, then to the faces around us. For the first time in a long time, I did not look away. I kept my hand flat on the table and felt the chill of the polished wood seep into my palm, a strange grounding sensation while everything else hovered on the edge of breaking. The room waited. My mother's smile stayed fixed. My sister's candle burned steady. And in that suspended moment, something old and familiar rose up in me, not panic, not anger, but recognition. This did not start tonight. It never did. The sound of my mother's voice, that soft warning edge she used when she wanted obedience without a scene, pulled me backward in time before I could stop it. Don't do anything weird. Not tonight. She had said versions of that sentence my entire life. Different words, same message. Behave. Be easy. Make things smooth for everyone else. I was trained for this. I didn't know it then, of course. When you're young, you don't call it training. You call it being good, being helpful, being mature for your age. The adults smile when you do what they need, and you learn quickly which version of yourself gets approval and which one gets ignored. My earliest memory of it is small and almost laughable now. I was 7, maybe 8, standing in our kitchen in North Carolina, feet cold on the tile, watching my mother tie my sister's hair into a perfect ponytail. Sienna was spinning in place, humming, impatient to get to her dance class. I stood near the counter with my backpack on, waiting to ask for something, anything that felt important to me. My mother glanced at me over Sienna's shoulder and said, "Morgan, can you grab her shoes from the hallway? Be a sweetheart." I did it without hesitation. I always did. When I came back, Sienna was already out the door, my mother calling after her, telling her how beautiful she looked, how proud she was. I stood there holding the shoes, unsure what to do with them now. My mother took them from my hands absently and set them by the door. "What did you need?" she asked, already distracted. I don't remember what I wanted to say. I only remember how quickly it felt unimportant. That was how it went. Not cruelty, not outright rejection, just constant, gentle redirection toward usefulness. If Sienna was the star, I was the stage crew. Invisible unless something needed to be fixed. As we grew older, the roles hardened. Sienna got praise for who she was. I got praise for what I did. She was charming, she was creative, she was special. I was responsible. The word followed me everywhere like a badge I never asked for. Teachers said it at parent conferences, relatives said it at holidays. My mother said it with a nod, like she was proud of herself for raising a child who required so little from her. "Morgan is so responsible. We never have to worry about her." What no one ever asked was what it cost. In middle school, when Sienna decided she wanted to try cheerleading, my parents found the money. New uniform, private lessons, weekend competitions. When I asked about joining a science program that met after school, my mother frowned at the paperwork and said, "That seems like a lot. Can't you just use the library?" I didn't argue. I learned early that pushing back made things uncomfortable, and discomfort always landed on me. By high school, it was second nature. I packed my own lunches. I filled out my own forms. I learned how to stretch money, how to say it's fine when it wasn't. When Sienna forgot her homework, my mother drove it to school. When I forgot mine, once my mother sighed and said, "I thought you were more organized than that." I was praised for not needing anything. And slowly, quietly, I stopped asking. Money entered the picture the way it always does in families like mine, disguised as help. I was 17 when my mother first asked me to cover something small: gas money for Sienna's trip. I had just started working part-time at a local clinic filing charts after school. I handed over a 20 without thinking. Family helps family, my mother said, squeezing my arm. She never paid me back. It wasn't a loan, it was a lesson. In college, the gap widened into something undeniable. Sienna went to a private school 2 states away. Her tuition covered her apartment, furnished her fridge stocked when she visited home. I went to a state school close enough to commute for a while, working nights and weekends to cover what scholarships didn't. When I mentioned how exhausted I was, my mother smiled like I was telling a charming story. "You've always been so strong," she said. Strong became another word for silent. I told myself adulthood would change things. I believed that once I was fully independent, once I paid my own rent and built my own life, my family would have to see me differently. Distance would reset the board. Responsibility would finally belong to everyone equally. For a while, it felt true. I moved out of state, started my career, built a life that didn't revolve around my family's needs. I felt lighter, proud. I paid my own bills and didn't resent it because they were mine. Then the calls started. At first, they were casual. "Can you help your sister look over this lease? She's overwhelmed. Can you spot her for a bit? Just until next month. Can you handle this paperwork? You're so good with details." Each request was framed as temporary. Each one was delivered with warmth. And each one assumed my answer before I gave it. I remember the first time I hesitated. I was in my late 20s, sitting at my kitchen table after a long shift when my mother called to ask if I could cover a deposit Sienna was short on. "Just this once," she said. She sounded tired, almost vulnerable, and that scared me more than anger ever had. I said yes. Of course I did. The pattern solidified after that. My sister floated from job to job, city to city, always chasing something bigger. My parents enabled her because they believed in her. I supported her because I was supposed to. The difference mattered. When Sienna struggled, it was framed as potential waiting to bloom. When I struggled, it was framed as something to handle quietly. I started noticing what happened when I said no, even softly. Conversations cooled. Invitations came with less enthusiasm. My mother's tone shifted, subtle but sharp, like a blade hidden in silk. "You've changed," she said once when I declined to help with another expense. "I don't know what's gotten into you." The implication was clear. Independence was acceptable as long as it didn't inconvenience them. I began to feel the weight of it in my body before I could articulate it in words. A tightness in my chest when my phone rang. A knot in my stomach when I saw my mother's name light up the screen. The dread wasn't about money. It was about being pulled back into a role I was trying to outgrow. The hardest part was how invisible it all was to everyone else. From the outside, we looked like a close family. Supportive. Generous. My mother basked in that image. She loved being seen as the parent who gave endlessly, even if the giving was uneven. I started keeping parts of my life to myself. Promotions, achievements, moments I would have once shared automatically. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they would be met with polite approval and quickly redirected back to Sienna. When Sienna failed, it was a crisis. When I succeeded, it was expected. I thought about that as I sat in the restaurant, the bill heavy on my lap, the room buzzing with expectation. This was the most public version of the same story. My mother celebrating my sister's shine, then turning to me to absorb the cost. The realization settled over me with surprising calm. I wasn't angry because this was new. I was angry because it was familiar. I had spent decades being the solution so no one else had to feel discomfort. I had been praised for it, relied on for it, and quietly punished when I questioned it. I looked at my sister again, really looked. She hadn't asked me to pay tonight. She didn't need to. The system had already been built. She lived inside it comfortably, never questioning who laid the foundation beneath her. My mother cleared her throat, a small sound meant only for me, a reminder. The waiter shifted again, waiting for the end of the scene he assumed was coming. I breathed in slowly and let the memory of that little girl in the kitchen surface, the one holding shoes she wasn't sure what to do with. The one who learned that love was something you earned by being useful. I wasn't that girl anymore, but the habit was still there, humming under my skin, urging me to comply, to smooth things over, to protect everyone else from discomfort. I sat with that urge instead of obeying it. For the first time, I didn't rush to make the room comfortable. The silence stretched, and somewhere deep inside me, a different thought took shape, quiet but unshakable. If I had been trained to carry this weight, then I had also learned exactly how heavy it was. That knowledge would matter. I lifted my eyes from the bill and let them move slowly around the table, taking in the faces, the posture, the assumptions. I wasn't ready to speak yet. Not tonight. Not like this. But something fundamental had shifted. The reliable one had finally noticed the cost of reliability, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. I pressed my fingers into the table again, grounding myself, and waited not for permission, but for the moment when the next move would become clear. My mother didn't like waiting, not when an audience was watching, and I could feel her impatience gathering the way a storm gathers heat. The silence at our end of the table started to draw attention. Little flickers of curiosity from relatives who had been smiling and clinking glasses a moment ago. I kept my posture steady, my hand still on the table, and in my mind I stepped back. To the first time I truly believed adulthood would set me free. When I left home after college, I told myself that distance would do what fairness never had. I moved to Raleigh for my first real job, rented a small apartment with thin walls and mismatched furniture, and felt proud every time I paid my own bills. There was something almost holy about it, signing my name on a lease, buying my own groceries, choosing my own life without asking permission. For a few months, my mother's calls were normal. She asked how work was going. She asked if I had met anyone. She asked if I was eating enough, the way mothers do when they're trying to sound caring without getting too close. I started to relax. I started to believe I could be a daughter and still be my own person. Then, one Tuesday night, my phone rang while I was heating up leftover pasta. I remember because I was tired and hungry and looking forward to a quiet evening. My mother's name lit up the screen and I answered with a cautious cheeriness. "Hey, Mom." She didn't waste time. "Honey, I need a favor." My stomach dropped just a little because I knew that tone. It sounded sweet, but it was always a setup. "Sienna's in a bit of a bind," she said. "Nothing serious. She just needs help covering her car insurance this month. It's only a few hundred. She's been so stressed. You know how she is." I stared at the microwave clock like it could tell me what to do. A few $100s wasn't impossible. I had it. That wasn't the point. "Why can't she cover it?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. My mother sighed the sigh that always carried disappointment disguised as patience. "Morgan, she's trying. She has so much going on. You have always been the strong one. This is just for now. Just for now." Those were the magic words. They turned a demand into a favor, a pattern into a one-time exception. I said yes. Of course I did. I transferred the money that night. My mother thanked me, warm and grateful, and for a moment I felt good, useful, needed. It took me years to understand that the feeling wasn't love, it was relief, and it belonged to them, not me. After that, the calls became more frequent and the requests became more polished. They weren't always directly about money. Sometimes it was my time. Sometimes it was my energy. Sometimes it was my signature on something, my attention to details. My ability to make problems disappear quietly. Sienna moved to Atlanta for a job that lasted 3 months. Then she moved to Nashville for a relationship that lasted even less. She bounced like a pinball, always chasing a new dream, always certain the next city would be the one that finally recognized her. My parents called it ambition. I started to call it chaos. When she needed help, my parents rushed in first, and when their help wasn't enough, they looked to me like it was natural. My father co-signed a lease when her credit wasn't strong enough. My mother paid for furniture because Sienna's new place had to look right for her photos. Then, inevitably, my mother would call me with that soft voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. Could you cover the deposit just until she gets settled? Could you pay her phone bill for this month? Could you handle the hotel for our family trip, and we will pay you back later? Later rarely came. And if I hinted at it, if I mentioned repayment even casually, my mother's expression would change even through the phone. Her voice would cool. I raised you, Morgan. I didn't keep a ledger. But she did keep one, just not for herself. She kept it for me. She remembered every time she bought me a coat as a kid, every dentist appointment, every school supply run, and she pulled those memories out like receipts whenever I hesitated to be useful. Meanwhile, my countless hours, my money, my emotional labor disappeared into the family story without acknowledgement. It got worse when I started doing well at work. The first time I got a promotion, I called my parents because I wanted to share it. I remember standing in the hallway outside the hospital, still in Scrub's cheeks, flushed with pride, waiting for their excitement. My mother said, "That's nice, honey. I'm glad you're doing well." My father said, "Good job, kiddo," and then cleared his throat. And then my mother said, "Speaking of jobs, Sienna's really struggling. Her boss doesn't appreciate her. Can you talk to her? Maybe help her think through options?" My excitement drained out of me like water through a cracked cup. I started to notice how quickly my life became a footnote. My achievements were never celebrated. They were used as proof that I could handle more. If I was stable, then I could absorb instability. If I was responsible, then I could carry irresponsibility. If I was fine, then no one had to ask if I was actually okay. I tried to tell myself it was normal. Families rely on the dependable one. That's what people do. But other families didn't do it like this. I saw it in my friends, in coworkers, in the families of patients I cared for. They helped each other, yes, but the help wasn't assumed. It was asked for with humility, met with gratitude, and balanced over time. In my family, the balance never came. It always tilted toward Sienna. The first time I tried to push back, I did it gently, like someone tapping on a glass window, hoping not to break it. My mother had called asking me to cover the difference on Sienna's rent because a brand deal had fallen through. Sienna was living in a high-rise apartment she could barely afford, but she loved it. The view, the vibe, the image. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing my own bills, my savings goals, my plans. I had been working extra shifts because I wanted to pay off my student loans faster. I was tired, and for the first time, I felt something harden inside me. "Mom, I can't do that," I said. "I have my own bills." There was silence. Then my mother laughed softly like I had told a joke. "Morgan," she said, "you're not broke. You're just being difficult." My face went hot. "I'm not being difficult. I'm being honest." My mother's tone sharpened. "Family doesn't abandon family when things get tough." I stared at the wall, the familiar guilt rising. It was automatic, like a reflex. The fear of being labeled selfish, ungrateful, cold. I said, "I'm not abandoning anyone. I just can't keep doing this." My mother exhaled loudly. "You sound jealous. It's not attractive." Jealous. That word again, the weapon she loved because it made my need for fairness sound petty. It made me the problem. I swallowed, forced calm. "It's not jealousy. I just need boundaries." My mother repeated the word like it tasted bad. Boundaries. And then she said, "Don't let people fill your head with nonsense. You're family. You don't get boundaries from family." I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't a bank, I wasn't a cushion, I wasn't an endless supply, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself I could talk to her later when she wasn't defensive, when she wasn't tired, when there wasn't a crisis. Later never came. Instead, the punishment came quickly and quietly. My mother stopped calling for a while. My father's texts became shorter. The family group chat went silent around me like I'd been muted. I saw pictures posted online of Sunday dinners I hadn't been told about. I heard about Sienna's new projects from other people, not from my own parents. The message was clear. If I wasn't useful, I wasn't included. That was when I began to understand that the connection I thought we had was conditional. The closeness wasn't love, it was access. Access to my time, my money, my steadiness. When I softened when I sent a message asking how everyone was doing, my mother responded instantly with warmth. See, she wrote, I knew you'd come around. I knew you wouldn't let family down. She didn't ask about me. She didn't ask what made me say no. She just celebrated the fact that I had returned to my role. And I did return partially because the pressure was heavy. Because being iced out by your own family hits an old fear, the fear of being alone. Because I was raised to believe that being a good daughter meant being agreeable. But something had changed. I began to track the pattern more consciously. I began to notice the way my mother's requests always arrived wrapped in praise, and the way the praise always vanished when I resisted. My sister did her part too, even if she never said it outright. Sometimes she would text me something sweet, like she missed me, she loved me, she hoped I was doing well. Then a few messages later she'd mention something stressful. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so embarrassed. I don't know what I'm going to do. She rarely asked directly. She didn't have to. She knew my mother would call and my mother would make it my responsibility. I started to feel manipulated from both sides like a rope in a tug of war, and the realization made me sick. Then came the year my grandmother got ill. That year cracked something in our family that had been held together by denial. My parents were stressed my sister was suddenly interested in being present because there were family photos to post, and I was the one coordinating appointments, talking to doctors, managing details, doing the real work. At the hospital, my mother was sweet to me in front of nurses, praising how capable I was. At home, she still turned to Sienna with pride, telling her how brave she was for showing up. After one long day, I sat in my car outside the hospital, hands on the steering wheel, and I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. I realized no one had asked if I needed anything. I realized my mother hadn't said thank you once, not privately, not sincerely. She assumed my help like she assumed air. I began to stop sharing my fatigue. I began to stop sharing my needs. It felt safer not to expect anything. That's what adulthood had done for me. It hadn't freed me from the shadow. It had just taught me how to live inside it without showing the bruises. Which is why the restaurant, the bill, the toast, all of it hit so hard. Because it wasn't simply a rude moment. It was the pattern made visible to strangers. It was years of quiet unfairness finally given a microphone. I glanced around the private dining room again, seeing it differently now. My mother's performance wasn't just favoritism, it was control. She was telling everyone in that room who mattered, who was adored, who was allowed to take, and who was expected to pay. I felt my throat tighten and I breathed through it. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, old and familiar, telling me not to make things uncomfortable. But I was uncomfortable. I had been uncomfortable for years. The most painful realization wasn't that my mother loved Sienna more. It was that my mother expected me to accept it without ever naming it. She expected me to fund it, support it, and smile while doing so. I looked at my father again. He finally lifted his eyes and held mine for a half-second longer than before. His expression was strained, guilty, tired. And still, he said nothing. I understood then that if anything changed, it would not be because he suddenly grew brave. It would not be because my mother suddenly grew fair. it would be because I stopped participating. The thought was terrifying and strangely comforting at the same time. My mother shifted in her chair and I saw the smallest flicker of irritation. She wanted this resolved. She wanted the folder closed to the card handed over the moment smoothed away so the party could continue and her image could stay intact. I didn't move. My sister's smirk faded into a more neutral expression, like she was adjusting her mask. She leaned toward a friend and whispered something, then glanced back at me. A question flickered in her eyes, not concern, but calculation. I could feel the air thickening. The room was starting to notice. The audience was waking up. And as my mother leaned slightly toward me, preparing to speak again, I realized that whatever happened next would not be fixed with another silent payment. This time, the pattern had reached its limit. My mother's hand lifted, her fingers hovering near her glass as if she was about to tap it again, to reclaim the room's attention and force me back into line. I watched her steady and waited for her next move. My mother's fingers never touched the glass. Instead, she leaned back and let the moment stretch, confident that discomfort would bend me the way it always had. The room murmured, and eventually the pressure eased when someone across the table laughed too loudly and the waiter drifted away again. Nothing exploded. Not yet. The night kept moving, but something inside me had already crossed a line it couldn't uncross. The first time I said no out loud didn't happen at that table. It happened weeks earlier, quietly, without witnesses, and it landed like a crack in a frozen lake. It was a Thursday afternoon when my mother called. I remember because I was walking out of the hospital after a long shift, the sky heavy with rain, my scrubs damp at the collar. I answered because I always did. "Honey," she said, skipping the greeting, "I need you to help me with something important." Her voice had that careful softness, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable before asking for something unreasonable. I slowed my steps, already bracing. "What is it?" I asked. She exhaled a practiced sigh. "It's about your sister. She's in a situation and we need to move quickly." "Nothing bad," she added too quickly. "Just a temporary thing." "Temporary?" I leaned against my car and closed my eyes. "What kind of situation?" "Your sister made a commitment she can't quite cover right now," my mother said. "It's complicated. She just needs someone to step in and smooth it over. You're so good at that." I opened my eyes and stared at the rain streaking down my windshield. "How much?" There was a pause. Then my mother said a number that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't small. It was enough to matter. I felt the old reflex surge, calculate, adjust, absorb. And then, surprisingly, something else followed. Fatigue. Bone deep and sharp. "I can't do that, Mom," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language. I waited for myself to soften them, to add an apology or an explanation, but they stayed where they were. There was silence on the other end, long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "You can't," my mother repeated, her voice flattening. "I can't," I said again, steadier now. "I have my own obligations. I can't keep covering things like this." Her response was immediate and cutting. "I never thought I'd hear that from you." "From you." The emphasis landed heavy, loaded with disappointment and accusation. I swallowed. "I'm not saying I don't care. I'm saying I can't keep doing this." My mother let out a slow breath, the sound of restraint. "Do you know what stress your sister is under right now? She's barely holding it together." I did know. I always knew. That knowledge had been used against me for years. I said, "I'm sorry she's stressed. I still can't do it." Another pause, then a different tone altogether. "Morgan, don't embarrass me. We are family. We support each other." Support had become a one-way street. I felt my hands start to shake, anger and fear tangling together. I forced myself to stay calm. Support doesn't mean unlimited access. I need to set some boundaries. The word hit the line like a dropped plate. "Boundaries," my mother repeated, incredulous. Since when do you need boundaries from your own family? Since always, I almost said. But I didn't. I said, since now. Her voice sharpened. You're being selfish. The word landed exactly where she intended. I felt the familiar stab of guilt, the urge to retreat to fix the rupture I had caused by speaking up. I'm not being selfish, I said. I'm being honest. She laughed short and humorless. You sound jealous. It's not attractive, Morgan. There it was. The old weapon. Reduce my need for fairness to envy. Make me small. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the car. This isn't about jealousy. It's about limits. My mother's patience snapped. I raised you. I sacrificed for you. And now when I ask for help, you turn your back on your own sister. My chest tightened. The conversation tilted the way it always did, from present reality to a list of debts I could never repay. I didn't turn my back, I said quietly. I'm just saying no this time. She went cold. If that's who you want to be, she said, then I guess I misjudged you. The call ended shortly after, not with a goodbye, but with a click. I stood there in the rain, phone still pressed to my ear, feeling like I had stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see if the ground would rise to meet me. It didn't. The days that followed were a study in absence. My mother didn't call. My father sent a single text asking if I was okay, then nothing else. The family group chat buzzed with unrelated chatter that seemed to flow around me, never to me. I watched from the sidelines as photos appeared online. My parents at dinner with Sienna, smiling, close, normal. The message was clear without being spoken. You are optional. It hurt more than I expected, even though I had anticipated it. There is a particular kind of ache that comes from realizing your presence is conditional. I had always suspected it. Now I was living it. A week passed, then another. I kept my distance, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of self-preservation. I told myself I was doing the right thing, even as doubt gnawed at me late at night. Then Sienna texted. Hey, she wrote. I heard things are tense. I hate that. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. What did you hear? She took a while to reply. Mom said you're upset about helping out. I didn't know it was such a big deal. Such a big deal. My jaw tightened. It's not about one thing I typed. It's about a pattern. She sent back a sad face and then another message. I never asked you to do anything. You know that, right? The denial was smooth, almost convincing. She had never asked directly. She didn't need to. The system worked without her effort. I know I wrote. That's part of the problem. She didn't reply for hours. When she did, it was with a message that stung more than anger would have. I just wish you could be happy for me without making everything complicated. I set the phone down and stared at the wall. That was the role she needed me to play. Cheer quietly. Pay silently. Complicate nothing. I didn't respond. My mother reached out a few days later, not with an apology, but with cheer. Her message was breezy, almost normal. She asked if I was coming to Sienna's birthday dinner. Said it would mean a lot to the family. Said she didn't want any awkwardness. Awkwardness. The word made me laugh, short and bitter. I said I'd think about it. She replied immediately. Good. Let's not make a mountain out of a molehill. The thing about saying no for the first time is that it doesn't feel empowering right away. It feels lonely. It feels like standing in an empty room where everyone else has left because you stopped playing your part. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being too harsh? Was I reading into things? Was it really that bad? And then, in quieter moments, clarity would return. I would remember how my stomach dropped every time my phone rang. How relief followed compliance, not because I was loved, but because conflict was avoided. I began to see that peace in my family had always been purchased, and I had been the one paying. The invitation to the birthday dinner sat on my calendar like a dare. Part of me wanted to decline to protect myself from whatever performance my mother was planning. Another part knew that absence would only fuel the narrative that I was the problem. So I said yes. My mother responded with a heart emoji and a reminder to wear something nice. Sienna was expecting a big night. The week leading up to the dinner felt strange, like the air before a storm. My mother called once to discuss logistics, her tone. All business, no warmth. My father sent a neutral text about travel plans. Sienna posted countdown photos online, each one carefully curated. No one mentioned our last conversation. No one acknowledged the tension. It was as if my refusal had been filed away as a minor inconvenience, something to be corrected later. I started to sense that the dinner wasn't just a celebration, it was a test. My mother had never let a boundary stand unchallenged. She didn't confront them directly. She eroded them through pressure, guilt, and public expectation. And this dinner, with its guest list and its setting and its carefully staged moments, felt like her next move. I thought about backing out. I thought about calling my mother and laying everything out plainly. But something told me it wouldn't matter. She didn't want understanding. She wanted compliance. So I prepared myself instead. I rehearsed calm. I reminded myself that no was a complete sentence, even if it wasn't respected. I promised myself that I wouldn't apologize for having limits. The night of the dinner arrived, and as I got dressed in my hotel room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I had a few years ago, but not in a bad way. There was something steadier in my eyes, something resolved. I didn't know exactly what would happen at that table. I didn't know how far my mother would go to reassert control, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had already crossed the hardest line. I had said no, and whatever came next would be built on that moment, whether my family acknowledged it or not. Saying no didn't make my life louder. It made it quieter in a way that felt unsettling at first, like stepping into a room after the music has stopped and realizing how much noise you were carrying inside your head. After that call with my mother, the one where I refused her without cushioning it, the silence stretched longer than I expected. Days passed without messages. Weeks slipped by without calls. At first, I checked my phone more than I should have, a reflex built over years of being on standby. Then slowly, almost without noticing, I stopped. The quiet was not empty. It was revealing. Without my family constantly pulling at me, I noticed how full my life already was. I woke up without that knot in my chest, the one that formed before I even knew why. I went to work and focused fully, not half listening for my phone to buzz. I spent evenings reading, cooking real meals, taking walks without mentally rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet. I realized how much of my energy had been spent managing other people's expectations, how much of myself I had edited down to fit into a role that made my family comfortable. They had never really known me, or maybe they had never been interested in knowing me beyond what I could provide. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something important. The version of me my mother thought she controlled was outdated. She was operating on an old script, assuming I was still the same daughter who would rearrange her life to avoid conflict. She didn't know who I had become. I didn't advertise it. I had learned long ago that sharing my successes with my family only made me more useful to them. So I kept my life compartmentalized. Work stayed at work. Achievements stayed with friends who celebrated without asking what I could do for them next. Over the years, I had built a reputation quietly, carefully. I was respected in my field. People trusted my judgment. They sought my advice and listened when I spoke. I had access to information and processes my family never bothered to understand because it didn't interest them unless it could be exploited. I had never hidden this out of spite. I had hidden it because experience taught me that visibility invited entitlement. My mother still saw me as dependable, not influential, competent, not powerful, useful, not central. That miscalculation was not accidental. It was convenient. It took a few days after I said no for me to understand the full shape of it. I was sitting at my desk late one evening, paperwork spread out, when I paused and leaned back in my chair. My mind drifted to the last few years, replaying moments I had brushed aside at the time. The way my mother would call me when something needed smoothing over, but never when decisions were being made. The way she assumed I would clean up messes without ever being consulted before they were created. The way she relied on my discretion, my calm, my ability to fix things quietly. They trusted me to handle consequences. They never trusted me with control. And then it clicked. They didn't just see me as reliable, they saw me as expendable. That realization didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with a steady chill. Because once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I thought about the last request my mother had made, the one I refused. It wasn't just money she wanted, it was insulation. She wanted my credibility, my steadiness, my willingness to absorb fallout so my sister could remain untarnished. They came to me because I was the only one who could do it cleanly, and they assumed I would. I went through old messages not obsessively, but thoughtfully. I noticed patterns I had ignored before. The praise that only appeared when I complied. The distance that followed resistance. The way my sister's name was always paired with urgency and mine with expectation. It wasn't personal, I realized. It was structural. I had been assigned a function. Once I understood that, something inside me shifted from hurt to awareness. Awareness doesn't erase pain, but it changes how you carry it. It turns confusion into strategy. I started to see where my leverage actually was. Not in money, not in approval, but in the very systems they depended on without acknowledging. My mother liked to think she was in control because she controlled the narrative. But narratives rely on silence. They rely on people agreeing not to say certain things out loud. I had been very good at staying quiet. That didn't mean I was powerless. It meant I had been choosing not to use what I had. I tested that realization in a small way, almost without meaning to. A mutual acquaintance reached out to me with a question related to a situation my sister was tangentially involved in. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just a routine clarification. In the past, I would have smoothed it over, handled it quietly, protected everyone from discomfort. This time, I answered honestly, professionally, without cushioning. The ripple was immediate. My mother called 2 days later, her tone lighter than it had been in weeks, but threaded with something new. Concern. "Did you talk to anyone about that situation?" she asked casually. I leaned back in my chair and let myself breathe. I answered truthfully but vaguely. I spoke like someone who was no longer afraid of sounding firm. Her response told me everything. She hadn't anticipated this version of me. She hadn't realized how much she relied on my silence to maintain control. After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring out the window. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I wasn't interested in exposing anyone for the sake of humiliation. I wasn't plotting a dramatic takedown. What I wanted was to stop being used as invisible infrastructure. There is a difference. As the birthday dinner drew closer, I paid attention to how my family behaved. My mother's messages became oddly polite. She avoided direct requests. She focused on logistics, on appearances, on ensuring I would be present. My sister didn't reach out at all. That told me more than words could have. If she had felt confident, she would have tried to charm me back into place. Her silence meant she was relying on my mother to handle it, to manage me. They still believed the dinner would restore the hierarchy. They didn't realize the hierarchy already had cracks. The night before I traveled for the birthday, I sat alone in my apartment, a glass of water in my hand, thinking about how easily this could have gone differently. If I had never noticed the pattern, if I had kept paying, if I had continued to confuse peace with love. I felt grief then real and heavy. Grief for the family I thought I had. Grief for the version of myself who believed that being useful would one day turn into being cherished. But grief doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it means transition. I packed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself, not like someone playing a part. I slept well, surprisingly well, and woke up calm. On the drive to the airport, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Looking forward to tonight. Let's just enjoy ourselves. I stared at the words for a moment, then put the phone face down. I understood now that enjoyment in her vocabulary meant compliance. It meant not disrupting the story she wanted to tell. I wasn't planning to disrupt anything. I was planning to stop protecting it. At the gate, waiting to board, I thought about how many times I had walked into rooms already braced to be smaller, already prepared to apologize for taking up space, already rehearsing how to make things easier for everyone else. This time felt different. Not because I had a plan to confront anyone, but because I had stopped underestimating myself. I knew what I knew. I knew what I was capable of. And I knew finally that my family's certainty rested on assumptions that no longer applied. As the plane took off, lifting smoothly into the morning sky, I closed my eyes and let the hum of the engine steady me. Whatever waited at that dinner, whatever my mother had arranged, it would not unfold the way she expected. I wasn't walking in as the reliable one anymore. I was walking in as someone who understood exactly where the power had been hiding all along, and I was done pretending I didn't see it. The call came 2 days before the birthday, late in the afternoon, when the light was already thinning and the office had settled into that quiet hum that follows urgency. I recognized my mother's number immediately, and for a second I considered letting it ring. Not out of fear, but out of choice. Then I answered because I wanted to hear how she would say it. "Honey," she began, and her voice sounded careful in a way that made my shoulders tense. "I need to talk to you. This can't wait." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. "What's going on?" There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. "It's about the family," she said. "About protecting us." Protecting us. The phrase landed heavy. My mother rarely spoke in plural unless she was asking for sacrifice. She asked if we could meet in person somewhere quiet. She said it would be better face to face. I suggested a coffee shop near my place, neutral territory, and she agreed too quickly, like she didn't want to give me time to change my mind. When she arrived, she looked composed but tight around the eyes. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick fresh, her posture straight. She smiled when she saw me, that public smile she practiced in mirrors, and reached out to touch my arm as if we were close. I let her. We sat. She ordered tea she didn't drink. "I'll get straight to it," she said, leaning in. "Your sister is in trouble." The words were measured, but the urgency underneath them was real. My heart kicked once hard. I waited. "She made a mistake," my mother continued. "Not a big one, not something she can't recover from, but it needs to be handled carefully." Handled carefully was another familiar phrase. It usually meant quietly, quickly, and without involving the people who might ask questions. "What kind of mistake?" I asked. She waved her hand as if brushing away a fly. "It's complicated. The details don't matter. What matters is that it doesn't turn into something bigger." My jaw tightened. The details always mattered. They mattered to me because I was the one expected to deal with consequences. "Mom," I said, "I need to know what you're asking." She exhaled and glanced around the cafe as if checking who might overhear. Then she lowered her voice. "There's a situation involving some paperwork and a timeline that needs adjusting." "Nothing illegal," she added quickly, "but it could look bad if it's misunderstood." That sentence alone told me more than she intended. She went on, explaining just enough to frame it as a misunderstanding, an administrative issue, a technicality that needed smoothing over before it reached the wrong ears. And then she said the part she had been building toward. "We need you to step in," she said. "You know how these things work. You know how to talk to the right people." You can fix this. I stared at her, the cafe noise fading around us. You want me to fix something for Sienna? I said slowly that could have serious consequences. My mother smiled, relieved. I knew you'd understand. That's why I came to you. You're the only one who can do this cleanly. Cleanly. As in quietly. As in, without leaving fingerprints. What happens if I don't? I asked. Her smile faltered just a fraction. She recovered quickly. Then it becomes a mess. People start asking questions. Things spiral. Your sister's reputation could take a hit. And mine, I thought, but didn't say. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. This isn't about money. This is about protecting the family name. There it was. The unspoken expectation made explicit. I was being asked to absorb risk so everyone else could stay pristine. I asked questions, then the ones she hadn't prepared for. I asked about timelines, about who else knew about what documentation existed. With every question, her answers grew less certain, less polished. The story shifted slightly then again. Small inconsistencies appeared, the kind you only notice when you're trained to notice them. I felt a chill settle in my chest. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I need you to do this for your sister. She's fragile right now. She couldn't handle the stress. The way she said fragile made it sound like an excuse, and a weapon at the same time. And me? I asked quietly. What happens to me if this goes wrong? My mother frowned, genuinely confused. What do you mean? I held her gaze. If someone has to take responsibility whose name ends up attached to it. She hesitated. Just a second. It was enough. You're strong, she said finally. You can handle pressure. You always have. The sentence landed like a verdict. In that moment, something in me hardened into clarity. They didn't just trust me to fix things. They trusted me to be the fall guy. I pulled my hand back gently. I need time to think, I said. Her relief was immediate and telling. Of course, she said. Take the time you need. But we really need this resolved before the birthday. We don't want any distractions. So that was it. The dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a deadline. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I said I would look into it. My mother accepted that like a victory and stood to leave, her confidence returning now that she believed control was restored. As she walked away, she turned back and added almost casually, I knew I could count on you. I watched her go and felt a strange mix of anger and resolve, not because she asked, but because she assumed. That night, I didn't sleep much. I went through everything I knew, everything I could access, everything that intersected with what she had hinted at. The picture that emerged was worse than I expected. Not catastrophic, but close enough that the wrong move could cost someone dearly. And the someone was supposed to be me. The next day, my sister texted. Hey, she wrote. Mom said she talked to you. Thanks for being there. No question mark. No request. Just assumption. I didn't reply. Instead, I called a colleague I trusted, someone who understood the systems involved and didn't owe my family anything. I didn't give names. I didn't give specifics. I asked hypotheticals. The answers confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't something to touch lightly. This wasn't something to hide. It was something that needed accountability. I felt the weight of it then, the real weight. Not fear, exactly. Responsibility. The kind that comes with knowing the truth and deciding what to do with it. By the time my mother called again that evening, I was calm. I told her I had looked into it. I told her there were risks she wasn't acknowledging. I told her it wasn't as simple as she thought. Her tone sharpened. You're overthinking this. I'm not, I said. I'm being careful. She sighed, frustration creeping in. We don't have time for careful. We have time for solutions. I paused. I'm not comfortable taking this on the way you're asking. There it was. The line. Her voice cooled instantly. Morgan, she said, you're putting us all in a difficult position. I thought of the cafe, of her hesitation when I asked whose name would take the hit. I thought of how easily she had answered without answering. I said I won't do anything that puts me at risk. She laughed softly, the sound brittle. You're being dramatic. Maybe. Or maybe I was finally being accurate. We ended the call without resolution. Afterward, I sat in my living room with the lights off, the city noise drifting in through the window. I felt the pull to cave, to make this easier for everyone. It was a deep pull, old and powerful. But beneath it was something steadier. I realized then that the birthday dinner wasn't just about money or favoritism. It was leverage. It was a public stage designed to remind me of my place, to pressure me back into compliance before I could fully step away. They believed if they could control the moment, they could control me. They were wrong. I decided that night that I would not fix anything behind closed doors. I would not quietly carry consequences meant for someone else. If they wanted me involved, it would be on terms that didn't require my silence. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold. I didn't have a script. What I had was clarity. The next morning, my mother sent a message about seating arrangements and dress code. Nothing about the request, nothing about the risk, just logistics, as if the rest was settled. I let the message sit unanswered. As the day wore on, I felt a calm settle in that surprised me. Not confidence exactly, acceptance. Whatever happened next would be uncomfortable, but comfort had never protected me anyway. I packed my bag for the trip, choosing simplicity over armor. As I zipped it closed, I understood something important. The birthday dinner was no longer about celebrating my sister. It was about testing whether I would still protect a story that put me in danger. And I had already decided that I wouldn't. I turned off the light, picked up my keys, and stepped into the evening, knowing that the next time my mother raised her glass, the truth would be closer to the surface than she realized. The day before the birthday arrived, wrapped in a strange manufactured calm, the kind that feels less like peace and more like a warning sign you learn to recognize after years of living around storms. My mother sent a text that morning with the reservation time, the restaurant address, and a reminder about attire. Elegant. She added a smiley face at the end, the digital version of smoothing a wrinkle in a tablecloth. No mention of our last conversation. No acknowledgement of the request she had made or the way it had landed. Just logistics, as if everything important had already been decided. I didn't reply right away. I went about my day deliberately. I finished my work, closed out tasks, handed things off cleanly. There was comfort in doing things that had a clear beginning and end, a contrast to the emotional mess waiting for me. When I drove home, the sky was pale and steady, no hint of the thunder I felt building under my ribs. At home, I laid out what I would wear to dinner. Not armor, not defiance, just myself. Clean lines, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic. I caught my reflection in the mirror and studied it longer than usual. I saw tension there, yes, but also something new, a kind of readiness. The phone rang in the afternoon. My mother again. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, her voice was cheerful, almost light. Just checking in, honey. Wanted to make sure you're all set for tomorrow. We're really looking forward to having you there. Let's keep things easy, okay? Easy. That word had been following me for days. I deleted the voicemail without responding. Around dusk, as I was making dinner, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, then answered on instinct. It was an old family friend, someone who had known my parents for years but wasn't woven into the daily drama. We spoke briefly, catching up, and then she hesitated. I hope this isn't awkward, she said, but I wanted to give you a heads up. There's been some talk. Talk about what I asked. She paused. About your sister. About some things that might come up. Nothing concrete, she added quickly. Just murmurs. My stomach tightened. Murmurs where? She didn't say names. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. I thanked her for calling and hung up, my appetite gone. I stood at the counter, hands resting on the cool surface, and let the pieces settle into place. My mother hadn't just asked for my help. She had asked for my silence, and now that silence was cracking around the edges. Later that evening, my sister called. It had been weeks since we'd spoken directly. Her name on my screen still carried a reflexive tug, an old instinct to brace myself. "Hey," she said, her voice smooth, upbeat. "I wanted to make sure you're coming tomorrow." "I am," I said. "Good." She laughed softly. "I know things have been weird. Mom worries too much." That was one way to put it. She kept talking, filling the space with chatter about the restaurant, the guest list, the cake. She sounded relaxed, confident, like someone who believed the ground beneath her was solid. At one point she said, "I'm really glad you're handling things. It means a lot. Handling things." The phrase slipped out easily, unexamined. I took a breath. What things exactly? There was a pause, just a beat too long. "You know, everything. Mom said you've got it covered." Covered. Another familiar word. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch. Sienna laughed lightly. "You always take things so seriously. Just come and enjoy the night, okay? It's my birthday." There it was. The appeal to celebration, to obligation, to the unspoken rule that nothing unpleasant should be acknowledged during a performance. We ended the call politely, but something had shifted. She hadn't asked if I was okay. She hadn't asked what I needed. She had assumed my role just as my mother had. Afterward, I sat on the couch with the lights low, replaying the conversation. It struck me how insulated my sister was from consequence, how thoroughly she had been protected from the mechanics of her own life. I didn't hate her. That surprised me. What I felt instead was a clear-eyed understanding. She wasn't malicious. She was entitled. And entitlement, when left unchallenged, becomes dangerous. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from alertness. My mind moved steadily, not racing, connecting details, confirming what I already knew. The request my mother had made, the urgency, the timing, the dinner. This wasn't reconciliation. It was leverage. The public setting mattered. My mother had chosen it deliberately. She understood the power of witnesses. She believed that with enough eyes watching, I would fall back into line, swallow my objections, and do what was expected. She believed the version of me she raised still existed unchanged. In the early hours of the morning, I made a decision. Not about what I would say or how I would act, but about what I would no longer do. I would not protect a narrative that required my silence to survive. That didn't mean I would explode. It didn't mean I would expose everything impulsively. It meant I would not contort myself to keep other people comfortable. There is a difference. Morning came soft and gray. I showered, dressed, moved through the routine with calm intention. As I packed my bag, my phone buzzed again. My mother, one last time. "Safe travels," she wrote. "And remember, tonight is about celebrating your sister." I stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone down without replying. On the drive to the airport, traffic moved steadily, the radio low. I watched the city slide past, feeling oddly grounded. There was no dramatic swell of emotion, no surge of fear. Just clarity. At the gate, waiting to board, I caught sight of families gathered together, children tugging at sleeves, couples leaning into each other. I wondered how many of them were carrying unspoken roles, unbalanced expectations, quiet resentments, disguised as love. I boarded when my group was called and settled into my seat by the window. As the plane lifted the ground, falling away beneath us, I felt a small sense of release. Distance, even temporary, can sharpen perspective. By the time we landed, I felt ready. At the hotel, I dropped my bag and stood by the window looking out at the city where my family was waiting. Somewhere downtown, a private room was being set. Candles arranged, glasses polished, a story prepared. I changed clothes, smoothing fabric, checking details. When I caught my reflection again, I noticed something else. I wasn't rehearsing apologies. I wasn't planning how to appease anyone. I was simply present. As evening approached, I took a deep breath and picked up my keys. The air outside was cool, steady. I walked toward the waiting car with measured steps, feeling the weight of the night ahead and the steadiness beneath it. Whatever happened at that table would happen in front of witnesses. That was my mother's plan. What she hadn't considered was that witnesses don't just see what you want them to see. They see what's real. And I was done pretending otherwise. The restaurant announced itself before I even stepped inside, light, spilling through tall windows, warm and deliberate, like an invitation and a warning wrapped into one. Valets moved with practiced ease. Laughter drifted from the entrance. This was not a place chosen casually. This was a place meant to be seen. I paused just long enough to steady my breath, then walked in. The hostess greeted me by name, her smile precise. She didn't ask where I was going. She already knew. I followed her past the main dining room, past couples leaning close over candles, past tables set for anniversaries and celebrations, into a hallway that softened the sound of the world. At the end was a door slightly ajar, light glowing around its edges. The private room. The stage. When I stepped inside, the room was already filling. White tablecloths, polished silver crystal glasses catching the chandelier light overhead. Everything gleamed. Everything felt curated. This wasn't just a birthday dinner. It was a production. My mother saw me first. Her face lit up bright and public, the smile she wore when she wanted witnesses. She crossed the room quickly and kissed my cheek, her perfume familiar and sharp. "There you are," she said. "You look lovely." The compliment landed flat. It wasn't about me. It was about how we looked together. My father followed, quieter, his hug brief. He murmured something about traffic, about the flight, things that filled space without meaning. His eyes flicked past me, already searching for an exit. Then I saw my sister. Sienna stood near the center of the room, surrounded by friends, her laughter floating above the low hum of conversation. She wore a fitted dress that shimmered when she moved her hair, styled just enough to look effortless. She looked exactly as my mother wanted her to look: radiant, celebrated, untouchable. She caught my eye and lifted her glass in a small toast, a private acknowledgement that felt anything but warm. I nodded back, measured. The seating arrangement told the rest of the story before a word was spoken. Sienna's chair was positioned under the chandelier, the visual anchor of the table. My mother sat close to her, angled in, ready to lean into the spotlight. My father took the seat beside my mother, slightly back. Friends and extended family filled the remaining places, orbiting outward. My seat was placed near the end, close enough to belong, far enough to manage. I took it without comment. As more guests arrived, the room swelled with noise. Compliments flew toward my sister like confetti. "You look amazing. This place is gorgeous. Your mom outdid herself." Sienna accepted it all with practiced grace, a smile here, a laugh there, never deflecting, never uncomfortable. My mother basked in it, her pride visible, her posture taller with every admiring glance. She loved this part, loved being seen as the architect of something beautiful. She leaned toward me once, her voice low. "Isn't this perfect?" I nodded. "It is." She squeezed my arm lightly, a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching. Her fingers pressed just a bit harder than necessary. I felt the warning beneath it. Dinner began smoothly. Wine was poured. Plates arrived, each course more ornate than the last. Conversation flowed in practiced loops. Stories retold, jokes recycled. I listened more than I spoke, observing the way people leaned toward Sienna, the way my mother steered attention back to her whenever it drifted. I noticed small things, how the staff deferred to my mother, how the manager stopped by twice to ensure everything was satisfactory, how my mother responded with confidence as if she were hosting in her own home. This room was hers. Halfway through the meal, I felt it. A shift. Subtle but unmistakable. The tightening in my chest. The sense that something was approaching. I looked up just as my mother reached for her glass. The sound of it tapping gently against the crystal cut through the chatter. One tap. Then another. The room quieted obediently, conversations trailing off forks, pausing midair. This was her moment. My mother stood smoothing her dress, her smile already in place. She glanced around the table, making sure she had ensured everyone's attention, then turned toward my sister. I felt my shoulders tense. She began by talking about family, about love, about pride. Her voice carried easily practiced and warm, filling the space. She spoke about watching Sienna grow, about her talent, her resilience, her sparkle. Each word was polished, each sentence designed to draw a reaction. I watched the faces around the table, smiles, nods, a few misty eyes. Then she said it. She's the daughter I'm most proud of. The words landed cleanly, decisively, like a stamp pressed into wax. Applause followed instantly, enthusiastic and unquestioning. Glasses lifted. Someone laughed softly. Someone else said amen under their breath. I clapped too lightly, automatically, my hands moving before my mind caught up. The sound felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. My mother beamed. Sienna stood and blew kisses, basking in the moment, the crown firmly placed on her head. I sat very still. The toast ended and the room exhaled. Conversation resumed, louder now, buoyed by emotion. Sienna was hugged. My mother accepted congratulations like they were owed. I noticed something then. Something small, but telling. My mother never looked at me during the toast. Not once. I had expected it somehow. A glance. An acknowledgement. Something to soften the blow. There was nothing. The omission spoke louder than the words themselves. Servers moved in with dessert, elegant plates set carefully before each guest. A cake was placed in front of Sienna, candles already lit. The room leaned in again, phones coming out, cameras ready. Happy birthday filled the air. As the song faded and Sienna blew out the candles, applause rose once more. Laughter followed. The energy peaked. And then, just as the room began to settle, just as people returned to their plates and glasses, a waiter approached our end of the table. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked with the calm assurance of someone following instructions. He stopped beside me. For a split second, I saw confusion flicker across his face, as if he were double-checking. Then he placed the black folder gently on the table in front of me. The sound it made was barely audible. A soft tap against linen. But to me, it rang. The folder rested there, closed, its weight unmistakable. I didn't open it yet. I didn't need to. I already knew. I felt eyes shift. Curiosity. Recognition. A few guests glanced at the folder, then at me, then away, pretending not to notice. My sister didn't look down. She smiled, laughing at something a friend said, completely unbothered. My mother didn't sit back down. She remained standing for a beat longer than necessary, her glass still in hand. Then she turned slightly, just enough to address the table again. As always, she said lightly, "Morgan will take care of it." The words were delivered with ease, like an established fact, like gravity. A few people chuckled. Someone nodded. Someone else murmured, "How generous." The waiter glanced at me, professional waiting. I finally looked down and opened the folder. The number stared back at me, crisp and undeniable. $1,980. For a moment, everything else receded. The room, the noise, the music playing faintly somewhere beyond the walls. It all narrowed to that number and the understanding that came with it. This wasn't about paying for dinner. This was about placement. This was my mother once again drawing the lines publicly. This was her saying who was celebrated and who was expected to cover the cost of that celebration. This was years of quiet conditioning condensed into one visible moment. I felt heat rise in my chest, but my hands remained steady. I closed the folder slowly and rested my palm on top of it. My mother finally sat satisfied. She took a sip of champagne and leaned toward my sister, whispering something that made her laugh. My father stared at his plate. Across the table, a cousin caught my eye. Her expression tightened, then she looked away, embarrassed. The waiter shifted slightly, still waiting for my card. The room waited too. I didn't move. The pause stretched thin and uncomfortable. My mother's smile flickered just for a moment as she sensed the delay. She turned her head slightly toward me, her voice low but sharp. "Go ahead, honey." I lifted my eyes from the folder and met her gaze. Something passed between us then. Recognition. Resistance. A challenge neither of us spoke out loud. I didn't speak. Not yet. The bill sat between us like a marker, like a line drawn carefully in ink. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to erase it. The room held its breath. So did I. The silence didn't break the way people expect silence to break. It didn't shatter or snap. It thickened, spreading slowly across the table like spilled syrup, heavy and impossible to ignore. I kept my hand on the folder and felt the faint texture of the leather under my palm. The number burned in my peripheral vision even with the folder closed. $1,980. It wasn't the amount that stunned me. It was the certainty behind it. The confidence that this moment had already been decided without me. My mother tilted her head, still smiling the way she did when she wanted to look patient in front of others. She waited a beat longer, then said my name again, softer this time, as if coaxing a child. "Morgan." I looked up slowly, deliberately, and met her eyes. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. Around us, forks hovered. Conversations faltered and failed to restart. Someone cleared their throat. The waiter shifted his weight, glancing between my mother and me, unsure which of us he should be taking cues from. My sister finally glanced down at the folder just briefly, then back up at her friend. She smiled again, smaller this time, tighter. She took a sip of champagne and said nothing. I realized then that everyone at that table believed this was the climax. This was the moment. Would I comply or cause a scene? Would I smile and pay or embarrass my mother and ruin my sister's night? They thought the story was about money. That was their mistake. I slid the folder a fraction of an inch away from me, not enough to send it across the table, just enough to make it clear it wasn't anchored to me. The movement was small, but it drew eyes. My mother's smile thinned. "Don't be dramatic," she said lightly. "It's just dinner. Just dinner." The phrase felt almost laughable. I spoke calmly, surprising even myself. "Whose dinner is it?" Her brows knit together. "What do you mean?" "I mean, whose dinner am I paying for?" I said, because I ordered a salad and sparkling water. A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter. Something sharper. My mother let out a soft sigh, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "Morgan, this isn't the time to nickel and dime. Tonight is about celebrating your sister." I nodded once. "I agree. It is." My sister finally looked at me, then really looked at me, her smile slipping. "Why are you making this awkward?" she said. "It's my birthday." The word awkward landed like an accusation. The implication was clear. Any discomfort was my fault. I kept my voice even. "I'm not making anything awkward. I'm asking a question." My father shifted in his seat, his chair scraping slightly against the floor. "Morgan," he began, then stopped, his voice trailing off. He rubbed his hands together and looked down again. My mother leaned forward. We raised you, she said, her tone sharpening. The least you can do is cover one dinner. The least you can do. That phrase carried decades of weight. I felt something settle in my chest, firm and unmovable. This isn't about what I can afford, I said. It's about why you assume I should. A murmur passed through the table. Someone's eyes widened. Someone else looked down at their plate, suddenly very interested in dessert. My sister shook her head slightly. I didn't ask you to do this, she said quickly. You're acting like I demanded it. I met her gaze. You didn't have to ask. Her mouth opened, then closed again. My mother cut in irritation, flashing now. We're not doing this here. Doing what I asked. Talking. She glanced around the table, aware of the attention, and lowered her voice. You're embarrassing us. The words slid into place exactly where she intended them to hurt. Public shame. The old lever. I inhaled slowly. I'm not embarrassed. That was true. I wasn't. For the first time, I felt something close to clarity. The waiter stepped forward hesitantly. Would you like me to split the check? He asked, his voice careful. My mother turned on him, her smile snapping back into place. No need. It's taken care of. I spoke before she could continue. It isn't. The room went very quiet. The waiter froze, eyes flicking between us. My mother stared at me, disbelief flickering across her face. Morgan, she said, this is not the time. It's exactly the time I said. I could feel my pulse steady but strong. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't shaking. I was simply done pretending. For years I went on, you've decided things for me. What I'll cover. What I'll handle. What I'll absorb so everyone else can enjoy themselves. Tonight just made it visible. My mother's cheeks flushed. You're twisting this. Am I? I asked. Or am I finally saying it out loud? My sister looked around, suddenly aware of the audience. Can we not do this in front of everyone? She said, her voice strained. This is supposed to be a happy night. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. Not guilt, not concern, expectation. She had grown up believing this was normal. I kept my tone gentle. It is a happy night. For you. And I'm not trying to take that away. But I'm not paying for it either. My father finally spoke, his voice low. Morgan, let's talk about this later. Later has always meant never, I said quietly. My mother pressed her lips together, then forced a laugh. You're acting like this is some big injustice. It's dinner. You're being overly sensitive. The minimization was automatic. Reflexive. I shook my head slightly. This isn't sensitive. It's cumulative. She stared at me, anger now breaking through the polish. You always do this. You always make things harder than they need to be. No, I said. I make them honest. The word hung there heavy. The waiter cleared his throat again. I can bring separate checks, he offered, desperate to restore order. My mother snapped her head toward him. No. I turned to him. Yes. The simplicity of it seemed to stun everyone. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around as if searching for support, for someone to back her up. She found none. People avoided her gaze. Someone took a long sip of wine. Someone else adjusted their napkin. My sister's face flushed. You're ruining everything, she whispered. I met her eyes. I'm not ruining anything. I'm refusing to pretend. The manager appeared at the doorway, sensing tension. Is everything all right here? He asked. My mother forced a smile. We're fine. I wasn't finished. I stood then, slowly pushing my chair back just enough to make my presence impossible to ignore. The movement sent a ripple through the room. People straightened. Phones were subtly lowered. Everyone watched. I placed my hand on the folder one last time and slid it toward the center of the table, not toward my mother, not toward my sister, but away from myself. I'm not paying this, I said clearly. Not tonight. Not anymore. My mother stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. You can't do this. I already am. The waiter nodded quickly, relief washing over his face, and stepped away to prepare separate checks. The manager lingered, eyes cautious. My father looked at me, then really looked at me, and something like regret flickered across his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no words left. My sister sat frozen, her champagne untouched. Now the smile gone completely. For the first time, she looked uncertain. The room buzzed with quiet tension. Conversations didn't resume. No one knew what to say. I felt something unexpected then. Not triumph. Not rage. Release. I gathered my purse and stood fully, the chair scraping softly against the floor. My mother whispered my name, sharp and urgent, but I didn't respond. I didn't look at the bill again. I didn't look at my sister. I didn't look at anyone. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, voices started up in low, urgent tones. Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked. The careful illusion cracked. As I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, my hand resting on the frame. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't exposed everything. Not yet. But the room would never look the same again, and neither would I. I stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the restaurant rushing back in around me, and took my first full breath of the night, knowing the real reckoning was still ahead. My legs carried me down the hallway on their own, but my mind stayed anchored to that room, to the shifting faces, the sudden vacuum where my compliance used to be. The restaurant sounds pressed in on me again, clinking glasses and low laughter from other tables, the normal world continuing while mine cracked open behind a closed door. I could have left then. I could have walked straight out into the night and let the consequences fall where they may. Part of me wanted to, not out of fear but out of exhaustion, but I had learned something in all my years of being the reliable one. If you walk away too soon, the story gets rewritten without you. My mother was already rewriting it in her head, turning me into the villain, turning my refusal into cruelty, turning her own choices into my betrayal. So I stopped near the host stand, where the light was softer and the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. I stood with my purse hanging from my shoulder and waited. Not for permission. For the moment when control would slip enough for the truth to be heard. Behind me, the private room door opened. My mother emerged first, her expression tight and bright at the same time, like she was holding her face in place. My father followed, looking smaller than he had at the table. My sister stayed inside, at least for the moment, which told me she didn't know what to do without my mother guiding her. "Morgan," my mother said, her voice low but sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned slowly. "I'm leaving." "No, you're not," she said. Her eyes flicked toward the host stand, toward the nearby diners, toward any witnesses. "You are not going to storm out and humiliate us." "I didn't storm out," I said. "I stood up for myself." She scoffed, a short sound filled with disbelief. "Standing up? That's what you call it. Making a scene." I kept my voice even. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I refused to be assigned a bill. My mother stepped closer. Her perfume hit me again, that familiar mix of flowers and something sharp underneath. "You are so dramatic," she whispered. "It was dinner. A birthday. You couldn't just do one nice thing. One nice thing. It would have been laughable if it didn't hurt." I looked at her steady. "You didn't ask me. You announced it." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her gaze flickered, recalculating. Then she changed tactics, smoothing her tone. "Fine. You want to be asked? I'm asking now. Please. Come back in and pay. We'll talk later." Talk later. The old trap. My father cleared his throat. "Morgan," he said softly, "can we just finish the night? We can sort this out at home." I stared at him. Sort what out? The part where you watched it happen and said nothing. His face reddened. That's not fair. Fair. The word echoed. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was finally being spoken. I lowered my voice. It is fair. You sat there while she told everyone I would pay. You didn't even look at me. My father's eyes dropped. He rubbed a hand over his mouth like he was trying to wipe away guilt. My mother snapped. Don't guilt him. Your father works hard. He doesn't need this stress. I took a breath. And I don't. Her jaw tightened. If you don't pay, she hissed, the restaurant will think we're cheap. They'll think we can't afford it. There it was. The real fear. Not my feelings. Not fairness. Image. I nodded slowly. That's what this is about. She glared. This is about family. No, I said. This is about the story you want everyone to see. And my job has always been to keep the story smooth. My mother's eyes flashed. You're being cruel. You know how much this means to your sister. My sister, as if summoned by her name, appeared at the doorway then. Her face was flushed, her eyes glossy, not with tears yet, but with the effort of holding herself together. She looked at me like she was trying to understand who I was now. Morgan, she said, her voice strained. Please. I don't know why you're doing this. I felt something soften in my chest just slightly. Not because I wanted to rescue her, but because I could see how little she understood about the machinery behind her life. I'm doing this because it keeps happening, I said. And because I'm not going to let it happen quietly anymore. Sienna's brow furrowed. I didn't ask you to pay. I nodded. I know. You didn't have to. You benefit from it anyway. Her lips parted, then pressed together. She glanced at our mother, then back at me. That's not fair, she whispered almost automatically, like she was repeating something she'd heard. I held her gaze. It is fair. You've never had to think about the cost because someone else always absorbed it. Me. Mom asked me to do something last week that could have put me at risk, and she assumed I would say yes. She assumed I would carry the fallout so you wouldn't have to. My mother stiffened. Stop, she snapped. My father's head lifted. What are you talking about? He asked. The air changed. Even the host behind the stand seemed to sense it, her polite smile faltering. My mother's eyes widened just a fraction. It was the first real crack I'd seen. Fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke slowly, carefully, like I was naming something fragile. You asked me to fix something for Sienna. I said to my mother. Something you called paperwork and a timeline. Something you said could look bad if it was misunderstood. My sister's face went pale. Mom, what is she talking about? My mother stepped closer fast, her voice dropping into a furious whisper. You will not do this here. My father looked between us, his confusion turning to alarm. Morgan, he said, what did she ask you? I kept my eyes on my father for a moment. She asked me to step in and smooth something over before it became a problem. And when I asked what would happen to me if it went wrong, she said I could handle the pressure. Like my reputation was disposable. My mother's lips pressed into a hard line. You are twisting my words. I shook my head. I'm repeating them. Sienna's eyes darted, searching. Mom. My mother turned on her, still smiling faintly because the host was nearby and other diners could hear murmurs. Not now, sweetheart. Go back inside. But Sienna didn't move. She looked at me, then at my mother again. What did you do? She asked, her voice smaller. My mother's smile slipped. She grabbed Sienna's arm gently but firmly. Go. Sienna pulled her arm back, surprised. Don't. My father's face had gone tight. He looked at my mother. What is this about? My mother's eyes flashed with anger and a strange kind of panic. It's nothing. It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding. Morgan is being dramatic. I looked at my father again. That's what she says when she wants me to stop asking questions. My father flinched like I'd struck something tender. The host cleared her throat softly, a reminder that we were in public. "Everything all right?" she asked. My mother straightened immediately. "Yes, absolutely. Family moment." I nodded to the host politely. "We're fine," I said. "We just need separate checks for the table." The host blinked, then recovered. "Of course. I'll let your server know." My mother's eyes snapped to me. "You cannot do that." I met her gaze. I already did. For a moment, no one spoke. The restaurant noise filled the gap, distant and normal, while my family stood in a little pocket of unraveling. My mother tried again, voice low. "Morgan, come back in. Pay. We will handle the rest privately. You're hurting your sister." I turned to Sienna. "Are you hurt because you're not getting a free dinner, or because you're realizing Mom's been making promises on your behalf without telling you?" Sienna's mouth trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about." I softened my tone just a little. "I know. That's the problem. You don't know because you've never had to know. Mom handles it. Dad signs it. And I clean up whatever's left." My father's face twisted, guilt and frustration mixing. "That's not true." I looked at him. "Is it not?" He didn't answer. My mother hissed my name again, harsh. "Enough." I took a slow breath. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone. I'm doing it because I'm done being your safety net without consent." My mother's eyes narrowed. "So what, you're going to destroy your sister's birthday because you're having some kind of crisis?" I shook my head. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm stepping out of a role you assigned me." Sienna's voice came out thin. "Mom, what did you ask her to do?" My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Her silence was its own answer. My father looked at my mother like he was seeing her differently, and for a second I wondered if he would finally speak up. His shoulders sagged instead. "We'll talk at home," he said, more to himself than anyone. I nodded. "We will. But I'm not paying tonight. And I'm not promising silence anymore." My mother's face hardened. "If you walk away from this," she said quietly, "don't expect us to forget it." I held her gaze. "I don't need you to forget. I need you to stop." The words hung in the air, plain and undeniable. My mother's nostrils flared. She turned sharply and walked back toward the private room, chin lifted, heels clicking on the floor like punctuation. My father hesitated, then followed, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before dropping away. My sister stayed frozen, looking between the door and me, as if she didn't know which version of reality to choose. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. I could feel my hands trembling now, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the delayed impact of finally refusing to bend. Sienna whispered my name softer. "Morgan." I looked at her. She swallowed. "Are you saying there's something I don't know?" I met her eyes and kept my voice low. "I'm saying Mom asked me to protect you in a way that could have cost me, and she assumed I would do it because that's what I've always done." Sienna's eyes filled not with dramatic tears but with something closer to confusion and dawning dread. She looked toward the door again, then back at me. "What is it?" I didn't answer yet. Not fully. Not here. Not with her still standing in the doorway of her old story. But I could feel the truth pressing closer to the surface, and I knew the next chapter would not be about a dinner bill. It would be about what my mother had tried to hide, and how much she had been willing to sacrifice to keep it hidden. The night ended without resolution, but it didn't end without consequence. I left the restaurant alone, the cool air outside wrapping around me like a verdict, and for the first time in hours my breath came easy. I didn't feel victorious. I felt spent. The kind of spent that follows a truth finally spoken after years of rehearsal. The next morning, my phone was heavy in my hand before it even rang. I knew who it would be. I also knew I wouldn't answer right away. I made coffee. I stood by the window and watched the city wake up, people walking dogs, opening shops, starting ordinary days that didn't hinge on whether they were loved for who they were or what they provided. I let myself exist in that ordinariness for a few minutes before the first call came through. It was my father. I let it ring to voicemail, not out of spite, out of necessity. I needed to hear myself think before I heard him. The message was short. He sounded tired. "Morgan, call me when you can. We need to talk." An hour later, my sister texted, "Are you okay?" That was it. No accusation, no demand, just a question that felt unfamiliar coming from her. I typed and erased 3 responses before sending one line. "I'm okay. We need to talk too, but not today." My mother didn't reach out at all. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. I spent the day moving slowly, deliberately. I went for a long walk. I ate real food. I let my nervous system catch up to the choices I'd made. By evening, the shaking had eased, replaced by a dull ache behind my eyes and a sense of inevitability. The reckoning wasn't finished. It had simply shifted locations. My father called again that night. I answered this time. He didn't waste words. "Your mother is furious," he said. "She feels blindsided." I leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling. She wasn't blindsided. She was exposed. He sighed. "That's not how she sees it." "I know." There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "What did she ask you to do?" I closed my eyes. I told him everything. Not emotionally, not dramatically. I told him facts. What she had said. What she had implied. What she had avoided answering when I asked about risk. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, the silence on the line felt different. He cleared his throat. "That wasn't okay," he said. The words were simple. Long overdue. I waited. Years of habit told me not to trust it yet. He continued, voice lower. "She didn't tell me the full story. She said you were overreacting." I felt a familiar flicker of anger, then let it pass. Overreacting is her favorite word for resistance. He didn't argue. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "I should have stopped it." "Yes," I said. "You should have." Another pause. I imagined him sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, staring at nothing. He had always been good at remorse after the fact. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. It was the first time he had ever asked me that without attaching an expectation. "I want accountability," I said. "Not apologies. Not smoothing things over. Accountability." He exhaled slowly. "She won't like that." I didn't smile. I don't need her to like it. We ended the call without resolution, but with something new between us. A crack. A possibility. 2 days later, my sister called. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Her voice sounded smaller than usual, stripped of performance. "I didn't know," she said right away. I didn't say anything. She rushed on. "About the paperwork. About the timeline. About you being asked to fix it." I didn't know any of that. Mom never told me. I believed her. Not because she deserved absolution, but because her confusion sounded real. My mother had always preferred to manage narratives alone. I asked her one question. "Did you ever wonder why I was always the one handling things?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I guess I thought you liked being in control." I let out a breath. That's what it looked like from the outside. She swallowed. "I never meant for you to get hurt." "I know," I said. "That doesn't change that I did." We talked for nearly an hour, haltingly circling the truth without fully landing on it. She admitted things she had never admitted before. That she felt pressure to succeed because our mother lived through her. That she avoided details because it was easier not to know. That she had always assumed I was fine because I seemed capable. Capability is a dangerous disguise. At the end of the call, she said something that surprised me. "I don't want Mom handling things for me anymore. I believed her too. Whether she would follow through was another matter. My mother finally called the next morning. I answered. Her voice was controlled tight with restraint. "We need to talk," she said. "We do," I agreed. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I was. She went straight to defense. "You handled that terribly. You humiliated me in front of everyone." I leaned against the counter and let her finish. When she paused, I said, "You humiliated me first. You just didn't expect me to refuse it publicly." She scoffed. "You could have talked to me privately." "I did," I said. "You didn't listen." Her voice sharpened. "You're twisting this into something it isn't." I stayed calm. "I'm naming what it is. You assigned me responsibility without consent. You minimized the risk to me. And you used a public setting to pressure me into compliance." She was silent for a beat, then said, "You always assume the worst of me." I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. "I assumed what you've shown me repeatedly." Her anger flared then. "After everything I've done for you." There it was. The ledger. The debt. I cut in gently. "This isn't a negotiation. I'm not asking for permission. I'm setting terms." She laughed brittle. "Terms? You think you get to set terms with your own mother?" "Yes," I said. "I do." The word hung between us. I laid it out clearly. No more surprise requests. No more public assumptions. No more asking me to absorb consequences for decisions I didn't make. If she wanted my help, it would be asked for directly with full information, and I retained the right to say no without retaliation. Her response was predictable. She accused me of being ungrateful, of being dramatic, of choosing conflict over family. I let her talk. When she finished, I said, "I'm choosing integrity over roles that harm me." She went quiet. I don't know how long the silence lasted. When she spoke again, her voice was colder. "I don't recognize you anymore." I swallowed. "I do." We ended the call without agreement. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion of her authority over me had cracked. She could withhold approval. She could sulk. She could rewrite the story for others. She could not make me comply anymore. In the days that followed, the fallout spread in small, telling ways. Family group chats grew cautious. Invitations arrived with qualifiers. My father made a visible effort to speak up when my mother overstepped. My sister began handling her own logistics clumsily at first, then with growing confidence. And my mother hovered at the edge of it all, orbiting her old habits like gravity, unsure where to land. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. One evening, a week later, my father called again. "Your mother is considering making things right," he said carefully. I smiled faintly. That will be up to her actions. I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. I was living without the constant pressure of being the fix. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I noticed how much space opened up when I stopped carrying everyone else's weight. I knew the story wasn't over. Not fully. Families don't change overnight. Patterns resist disruption. But the axis had shifted. I had stood up in a room full of witnesses and refused to play my part. I had named the cost. I had stepped away from a system that depended on my silence. Whatever came next would be built on that moment. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough to stand on. I didn't wake up the next day with a sense of victory. What I felt instead was quiet, the kind that settles after a storm has moved through and taken something heavy with it. The house sounded different without the constant hum of anticipation, without waiting for the next call, the next demand disguised as concern. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window. For years, mornings had begun with a mental checklist that wasn't written anywhere. Who might need me today? What problem could surface? How quickly I would have to rearrange myself to keep everything smooth. That checklist was gone now, or at least it was no longer automatic. The absence felt strange, not empty, spacious. My phone buzzed late that morning. A message from my sister. Can we talk? In person. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, listening to my breath. Part of me wanted to postpone it to keep the fragile calm intact. Another part knew that avoidance was how things had stayed broken for so long. I wrote back. Yes. Tomorrow afternoon. We met at a small cafe halfway between our places, neutral ground again, but this time it didn't feel like a battlefield. She arrived early and stood when she saw me, unsure whether to hug me. I let her briefly. She smelled like the same perfume she had worn the night of her birthday, but without the sharpness of adrenaline, it seemed softer. She didn't waste time. I've been thinking about everything you said, she began. About Mom. About you. About me. I nodded and waited. She wrapped her hands around her cup like it was something solid to hold on to. I didn't know how much you were carrying. I really didn't. I believed her. That didn't mean it erased the past, but it mattered. She went on, words stumbling a little. I've always thought of you as strong, capable. You never seemed like you needed help. So I assumed you were fine. I looked at her, then really looked at her and saw something new. Not entitlement. Fear. The fear of realizing that the ground you've been standing on isn't as solid as you thought. Strength can be misleading, I said. It can make people forget to ask. She nodded slowly. Mom handled everything for me. Still does, I guess. I didn't question it because it was easier not to. But after the other night, after Dad started asking questions, I started seeing things differently. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak her way through it. She admitted that there were things she hadn't wanted to know because knowing would mean responsibility. She admitted that being celebrated had become a kind of armor protecting her from consequences. She admitted that watching me walk out of that restaurant had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. I thought you were just mad about the money, she said quietly. But it wasn't that. It was the way Mom said it. Like it was a given. Like you weren't even part of the decision. I nodded. Exactly. She swallowed. I don't want that anymore. I don't want her doing things in my name without telling me. I don't want to be the reason you get hurt. That was the moment something loosened in my chest. Not forgiveness. Understanding. I told her I wasn't asking her to choose sides. I told her I wasn't asking her to fix our mother. I was asking her to own her life. Fully. Including the uncomfortable parts. She agreed, not dramatically but sincerely. We left that cafe with no hugs, no declarations, but with something steadier. A shift. My mother didn't call that week. When she did, it was brief and formal. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She didn't ask for anything. That alone told me how much had changed. Weeks passed, then months. Boundaries, I learned, don't announce themselves with fireworks. They show up in small, consistent ways. In the calls you don't take. In the explanations you no longer give. In the way you leave a room when the air turns familiar in a way that once trapped you. My father made a quiet effort. He checked in without agenda. He spoke up when my mother started to slip into old patterns. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes he succeeded. What mattered was that the silence was no longer mine alone to break. My sister handled her own affairs clumsily at first, then better. She stumbled. She learned. She stopped expecting rescue. We built something new between us, not closeness for show, but honesty. My mother hovered uncertain. She tested boundaries with small comments, with pointed sighs, with reminders of everything she had done. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I simply repeated my limits calmly every time. No surprise requests, no public assumptions, no silence demanded in exchange for belonging. Sometimes she bristled. Sometimes she retreated. Change, I realized, wasn't about making her understand. It was about making my position unmovable. The strangest part was how much energy returned to me once I stopped managing her reactions. I slept deeply. I laughed without checking my phone. I made plans that didn't include contingency clauses for family emergencies that weren't mine. One afternoon, months later, I walked past a restaurant window and saw a family inside celebrating something, glasses raised, faces bright. For a moment, my chest tightened out of habit. Then it passed. I thought about that night again, the weight of the bill, the way it had been placed in front of me like a verdict. I thought about how long I had accepted that role without naming it. Not because I was weak, but because I was conditioned. The truth is, favoritism doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like praise. Sometimes it looks like trust. Sometimes it looks like assuming one child will absorb what the other cannot. And revenge, real revenge, isn't about burning bridges or humiliating people. It's about refusing to be used as invisible infrastructure. It's about standing up in a room full of witnesses and choosing yourself without apology. My life didn't become perfect after that. Family dynamics didn't magically heal, but something far more important happened. I reclaimed my dignity. I learned that love without respect isn't love, that gratitude without choice is servitude. That peace bought with self-erasure is not peace at all. If you're listening to this and you've been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who always pays in ways no one counts, I want you to know something. You're not difficult for wanting fairness, you're not selfish for setting limits, and you're not cruel for refusing to fund your own erasure. If a moment comes when the bill is placed in front of you, whether it's money or silence or sacrifice, you're allowed to slide it back. You're allowed to stand up. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your experience or simply let me know you were here. And if you want to hear more stories about boundaries, justice, and reclaiming self-worth, stay with me, subscribe, and we'll keep walking this path together.